Let me call up Saya. Please tell us why you are passionate, why we should care. What are the problems?
Thank you so much. And I just want to say it's such an honor. It's also very humbling to be here in the Philippines talking about resilience in an urbanizing world. After all, the Philippines is a place that really has, I think, shown the world what it means to be truly vulnerable, to have vulnerable businesses and communities to the changes that we see coming in a warming climate. But the Philippines has also really shown the world what resilience can mean, and I think that's what makes this conversation so important to be having right now and to be having here. So I'm not here to educate you, that would be very presumptuous, about what resilience means, but rather to open up the conversation, I hope in more than one way today, about what we can see as potential solutions to help us move forward together more strongly in this changing world. I'm going to share with you first what the latest science tells us about the changes that we see coming. I'm then going to talk about what I think resilience means in this context. And finally, I'm going to pose a question to you as leaders about what you can do to help move the agenda forward in this very important place. So since we're all here at the invitation of Shell, I thought I would start by telling the story of two shells for any paleoclimatology nerds in the audience, like myself. The first here is this razor clam that you see in my title slide. I spent a whole summer working on these in Alaska as an undergraduate. These clams make a record of the environment that they live in. They grow like trees. They add new rings every year, and in years that are more, they're warmer and have more food, they build bigger tree rings. In years that are a little bit less comfortable, where they have less food, they don't grow as much. The second shell is this beautiful foraminiferan. This guy lived 33 million years ago. And like the razor clam, these organisms, which are tiny, they're microscopic, you can see in the scale, they build their shells by precipitating calcium carbonate out of the water that they lived in the bottom of the sea. And so these shells also contain a record of the environment that they lived in. So this is another organism that I studied as an undergraduate, probably spent more than 1,000 hours looking at these things through a microscope one summer. And what these tell us about the period of time that they lived in, 33 million years ago, this was a time of profound transition. It was a time when we were transitioning between the fairly warm Eocene to the fairly cool Oligocene, when we first had the appearance of this Antarctic polar ice cap that we now see today. So what can we learn from these two examples? First, I think this demonstrates that we actually know an incredible amount about the climate. We see the signs and the signals and the stories everywhere. And you'll hear a lot more evidence and stories from other speakers' examples today. We also know about how it's changed throughout the Earth's history, what drives those changes, and about how those changes interact with life on this planet. And in fact, the history of this planet is a history very much of change, a history of adaptation, of evolution, of survival and extinction. But it's important to recognize that the rate of change that we're seeing now is unlike any rate of change that we've seen in the records, at least that we have. The IPCC report that was released this past November was the synthesis of more than 30,000 such studies, and the consensus of thousands of scientists representing more than 100 governments. Their conclusion was that climate change is already causing impacts to natural and human systems on all continents and across all oceans, and that the risk of even more severe, widespread, irreversible impacts increases with each year that we fail to curb our greenhouse gas emissions. So over hundreds of thousands of years of relative stability, a period that allowed our civilization, our species, to flourish, the past 150 years have seen an increase of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere of 40%. The global average temperature has risen by 0.8 degrees, and that may not seem like a large number, but we're already seeing the impacts of this warming in our world. We're seeing that at the Earth's poles, and someone mentioned that Maria mentioned that I am currently living in Norway, so the Arctic is very immediate to me, that ice and snow is melting. It's disturbing ecosystems and infrastructure that very much are based on the premise of stable conditions in the Arctic and the Antarctic. We're seeing communities from California to Russia experiencing longer periods of drought and heat waves. we're seeing that the world's oceans have absorbed 10 to 20 times as much heat as the atmosphere has over the last 50 years. And why is that a big deal? Well, for one thing, the heat is expanding the ocean, so this is one of the major contributors to the 0.2 meters of sea level rise that we've seen over the past century. But even more important, this heat combined with the fact that warmer air can hold more moisture is amping up the strengths of hurricanes and typhoons. And all of these changes with only this 0.8 degrees of warming. If we continue to grow the way that we have been, scientists predict that we will experience 4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. And the amount of change that we can see in that kind of environment is simply beyond imagination. So even if we manage to curb emissions dramatically, which we must do if we're to keep warming to a level that we can adapt to, we're still entering a time of rapid change. And I've only mentioned the climate part. There are also changes going on in technology and the proliferation of the digital technologies and innovations, of new resource competitions, of changing demographics. So there are changes across the spectrum, and that's why this conversation about resilience is so important. The implication is really clear, I think. We must take steps now to build the resilience of our structures, of our systems, of our communities, if we want to avoid the kind of intolerable loss that we've already seen to property and life over the coming decades. So what does resilience mean? Well, there are many competing definitions of resilience, and I'm sure you'll hear about 10 today. Well, the one that we use at Xynteo is this: the ability of a system to thrive and grow in a climate of stress, shock, and surprise. So this encompasses things like engineering and technology, making physical structures more flexible, reinforcing the most critical elements of your system, and then building enough redundancy into the rest of the system that you can absorb losses when you see them. So in my hometown of New York City, after Superstorm Sandy hit, many of you may know that many parts of the city lost power for up to 3 weeks. And partially that was due to flooding in some key substations in the power system. So the city now has launched an investigation into which of these elements need to be shored up, which do we need to actually invest in building more substations and building the strength of the grid. Then there's also education. So equipping communities with the knowledge and the tools to anticipate, to prepare for, and to respond to these kinds of events. And the Philippines is obviously seeing that already very closely here in the preventive evacuation of homes and better coordination and planning and disseminating information, things that are starting to work well here. And I think there's an interesting point to make about education. There's a study that came out last year by a group called IASA that some of you might know, which found that education is actually a more important predictor than GDP in determining what your mortality is to natural disaster is likely to be. So I think that's just a really powerful reflection on the importance of education. Linked to education is empowerment. So instilling people with the confidence and the mental fortitude to endure and even thrive in stressful situations. This is a very kind of personal dimension. But there are groups like the Garrison Institute that are looking at things like meditation and yoga and how these tools can be used with aid workers, with communities at risk to help, at the very personal psychological level, us be better at surviving and adapting to traumatic things. And these kinds of storm events are obviously among those. And then finally, the fourth thing that I think is really interesting here is design. How can we find solutions to improve our resilience that actually offer co-benefits in development and improve our experience, our livability of our cities? And that's something that we've been looking at very closely in New York City, for example. So this is just one example of a project that won an award in the US's Rebuild by Design initiative. This is, some of you may recognize Lower Manhattan. And this group, the Bjarke Ingels group, has proposed a system of architectural solutions called the Dry Line. Some of you might know the High Line in New York, this awesome elevated park that goes all along the Lower East Side's waterway. It's basically, the concept here is utilizing some of these underutilized spaces along New York City's waterfront to both improve the city's protection against things like flood and storm surge, but also in doing so, to find out ways for achieving some co-benefits, so building berms that also that co-function as bike paths, reverse aquariums where under conditions of flood you're actually underwater and looking through glass at what's going on in the river, spaces that can be used for retail and for community recreational purposes. So I think this kind of can show us what the future of cities and resilient cities could look like. It's not just building sandbags and building flood walls. It can also be, resilience can be sexy, I think. So engineering, technology, education, design, empowerment, these solutions all require in turn a combination of finance, of collaboration, and of policy. And you'll hear some great concrete examples from our other speakers about how we can mobilize some of our resources here. But I think it's clear that whether you look at New York or whether you look at Manila, that cities can actually be really great laboratories for some of these forces to come into play and work together. So finally, I promised to pose a question to you all as leaders about the significance of this conversation here and now. This year, as we've heard, we'll see a reboot of the international efforts to tackle climate change. And so for all of you who, like me, have been working on this space for a while and are sick of complaining about the lack of global leadership on climate change, the lack of a framework agreement, all these things, that's ending this year. And in Paris, a new era is going to emerge, and it's up to all of us to shape the new business and the policy landscape that we're going to be operating in, and also to make sure that it succeeds. And Asia, and perhaps the Philippines in particular, have played a really unique role in this conversation so far, not just because Asia is home to some of the most vulnerable communities in the world, but also because for the past two COPs, the Philippines has kind of been acting as the conscience of the international community, and I'm sure this was a very memorable moment for many of you in this room, this Philippine delegates' very emotional plea to the delegates at the COP in Warsaw during Superstorm Haiyan. Philippines is also showing us what resilience can look like. This is, I think, an interesting example of how using social media can actually help us find new kind of creative, decentralized solutions to achieving resilience. This is a program that the UN has been sponsoring called Micromappers, and this is still very much in its embryonic stage, but this kind of thinking, I think, is really key to our conversation today. They basically had volunteers from around the world screening Twitter, looking for hashtags about this storm, and basically flagging and identifying anything that looked like pictures of infrastructure damage or cries for immediate relief, and then channeling that information towards aid agencies. So what does this all mean? I think the question that I really want to ask you all today is, how can resilience become a signature of an alternative growth model in what some people are calling the Asian century? In a world with increasing demand for food and water, with vulnerability to sea level rise and extreme weather, with rapid urbanization, as we've already heard today, are there ways that the kinds of high technology, very networked, socially networked societies that we see here, can they be a pattern for a resilient future? I just want to say, finally, a few things about why resilience is important to us at Xynteo. We've talked already about growth and how our mission is reinventing growth, and there's kind of no way to have that thought without building resilience in these days, I think. We also work very much on collaboration, about how companies can work together to achieve things that they couldn't otherwise achieve alone. And resilience is obviously very dependent on our ability to be able, as leaders, to collaborate with each other. But finally, there's something really important about the narrative power of resilience as a concept, and that's what I want to leave you with today. Resilience, how is that different from, say, sustainability? Well, resilience means that we aren't just victims of a future that we can't control. We are not razor clams. We shape the world that we live in, and we shape ourselves. So if you've ever watched a movie where humans are battling against a technologically superior species, or zombies, if you've ever watched a movie where the Little League team that no one thought had a chance of winning actually takes home the trophy, You've seen resilience in action. You've probably felt what the kind of power that has over your emotions. You've seen what resilience can mean. Resilience is what makes us human, and it's what makes us heroes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. The statistics are there, and they are alarming, right? So just to pick up from what Saya said, the local partner of Standby Task Force in the UN, OCHA, in doing this social media mapping is Rappler. And Project Agos, if you live in the Philippines, please join us in Project Agos. It is a way to take top-down government workflows and bottom-up social media engagement through a platform to actually help in every one of the average 20 typhoons we get every year.